مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. تغيرت في جميع أنحاء العالم الصلة الذي تربط بين أوروبا والشرق الأوسط بطرق غير مسبوقة. أوروبا تواجه أكبر تدفق للاجئين منذ الحرب العالمية الثانية، والتركيبة الديموغرافية للاجئين مدهشة، فإذا يفير مئات الآلاف من اللاجئين من سوريا والعراق بحثا عن الأمن والموت. ربما يكون هذا أكبر عدد من المسلمين يدخل أوروبا منذ الغزو العثماني قبل أكثر من 400 عام. في الشرق الأوسط الحرب في سوريا تشهد تحولا ينذر بالسوء مع وصول القوات الروسية، فهم اليوم تدربون جنود بشار الأسد، وغدا تبدو الفرصة سانحة لأن يحاربوا جنبا إلى جنب مع جنود الأسد. ما دور أمريكا في كل هذا؟ هل هي طرف فاعل أم مجرد متفرج؟ هل تشكل الأحداث أم أن الأحداث هي التي تشكلها؟ وما العلاقة بين هذه الأحداث واتفاق إيران النووي الجديد؟ لمناقشة هذه التغيرات الجذرية في العلاقة بين أوروبا والشرق الأوسط وتأثيرها على سياسة الولايات المتحدة، يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا المكونة من خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm here with my panel of foreign policy experts to discuss an issue that has risen to the top of the global agenda. No, I'm not talking about the Iran nuclear deal, although that is certainly connected to it. I'm talking about the strategic and humanitarian issues connected to Syria. Images of refugees from Syria and Iraq and elsewhere from the Levant flowing into Europe. Who triggered this? The worst refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Where does this come from? Juan, I'll start with you.
Well, this stems from the conflict, chaos, and instability of a number of places. Syria first among those. But you also have other parts of the region, the Mediterranean, for example, Libya, where you've had the breakdown of governance, you've had conflict and the rise of extremism. And that has forced people to be displaced internally, and certainly now be displaced to the borders of Europe. And as we all know, this has been a crisis for many years. You've had thousands pouring over the Syrian border, for example, into Jordan, into Turkey for years, and those countries in many ways absorbing the massive inflow of those refugees. Now what you see is that overflow beginning to float into Europe and beginning to impact the consciousness of the West. And I think that's really the tipping point that we have. It's Syria, Libya, the conflict in Iraq, the problems in other parts of Africa that are really bringing this migration and refugee crisis to the fore. And it's something that now is beginning to inject itself into the American consciousness as well, even though you don't have migrants floating onto the shores of the United States.
So why now to Europe, and who is at fault for all this? Dennis?
I really do think Syria is the main driver at this point. All of the other conflicts that Juan referred to are clearly part and parcel of this, but what has changed is that the reality in Syria is getting worse and the regime itself looks less steady. What you have now is a flow of people from Syria in particular that includes supporters of the regime and opponents of the regime. There is no safe haven anywhere for them. And something that Juan was referring to, all the neighboring countries basically got saturated. But the surprising thing is not that we have them flowing to Europe at this point. The surprising thing is it didn't happen earlier. Because it's been, for the last year, I would say, you've seen Lebanon close its doors, you've seen Jordan become more restrictive, Turkey the same, Iraq also. They couldn't absorb any more. Truth is, they absorbed more than they could in any case. So now, because the conflict has become worse, because the regime is under greater threat, there is no place to go, and so Europe has become the outlet.
And what role, gentlemen, in all of this does the United States play? What is our responsibility for this crisis, and what should be our contribution to resolving it? Juan?
Well, at the first level, there's a humanitarian question. What should the U.S. be doing to solve the humanitarian crisis of the refugees on the ground in Europe, and frankly, those that may want to come to North America? No doubt many of them would. And the question of how many of the refugees and the families will the United States and North America absorb amid all of this crisis is a question. And I think there's some criticism of the United States that we haven't done more, that the doors haven't been more open to these refugees. So that's a first level question. Morally, what are we going to do about the humanitarian problem? There's also the political and geopolitical question. How do you solve the problem of Syria? And for this, there's much criticism of what has been seen as a very passive American policy, where we've allowed the problems to fester, to get worse, watching the slaughter of innocents and the displacement of millions, and really not doing much to solve the problem other than beginning to deal with some of the terrorism dimensions of the threat. And so there's now, I think, a political debate brewing here in the United States around what can be done to either bring an end to the Syrian conflict or to bring at least relief to elements of the region and to the refugees that may not make their way all the way to Europe but need some relief on the ground. At the end of the day, the question is, can the U.S. be a part of a solution to the Syrian conflict? And at the end of the day, I think the U.S. has to be, because the U.S. has interests there, be they terrorist interests, concerns over the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremist groups, concerns over the humanitarian problem, and frankly, concern over stability in the region. Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey can't absorb the instability coming out of Syria and Iraq.
Dennis, what responsibility does America bear for this?
Well, I think that we've had a policy of what I would call avoidance for a long time. Then we had a policy that I think was designed to be containment of this conflict. Clearly, neither has worked. I think we should have created a safe haven a long time ago. It would have dealt with the refugee issue, but it also could have been a basis in which to create greater coherence among the opposition. It's
a safe haven inside Syria.
Inside
itself.
Syria. It's a truism to say that you need a political process, but it doesn't mean anything unless you affect the balance of power on the ground. And what we're seeing right now is that Putin has decided he's going to affect further the balance of power on the ground.
Putin, the Russian leader.
Right, and I think what's driving Putin more than anything else is our new interest in having a political process. Secretary Kerry a few weeks ago organized a meeting with his Russian counterpart and with the Saudi foreign minister, and the idea was to now work on a political process, particularly after the deal was done with the Iranians on the nuclear question. And I think the Russians have looked at that and they've said, all right, if there's going to be a political process, we're going to build our leverage first. Now what we should be doing is we should be focusing on a safe haven which is justified purely on the grounds of humanitarian considerations, but also it'd be our way to signal the Russians we're going to play by the same rules as you. We're going to create a safe haven. We'll work with the Turks, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the Qataris. We'll require things of them as well, but we're going to create a safe haven. Anything that's flying isn't going to fly there anymore. And we're going to change the balance of power even as we work to try to alleviate the humanitarian crisis.
So that's what you urge the United States to do. Yes. How do you evaluate what Russian strategy is? News reports of the Russians sending at the very least trainers and weapons and more materiel and potentially even expeditionary forces to join alongside Syrian government troops. What's their game?
Well, I think Dennis has it exactly right. The Russians want to impact not just their leverage on the ground, but their leverage diplomatically and geopolitically. The Russian interests haven't changed fundamentally over time. They've certainly supported Assad. They've been supporting him with arms, weaponry, training. This seems to be an amplification of that with more forces on the ground. And what's striking is how open and bold President Putin is about that support. Keep in mind, this is a regime that is accused of having engaged in chemical weapons attacks.
The Syrian government.
The Syrian government. Huge, the most sort of grievous humanitarian violations we've seen this century. The use of barrel bombs on civilian populations indiscriminately. just sort of wanton disregard for international norms and principles. And the Russians are very open and very proud almost that they are supporting Assad and that they are trying to influence on the ground. And part of this is to affect what happens on the ground in any negotiations. Part of this, I think, is part of a broader sense of Russian power and influence. We are going to do what we need to do to defend our interests. And finally, I think the Russians have said quite openly, we've told you, the West, all along, that this is really a problem of violent extremists and terrorism. And what we see with the rise of ISIS, with Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliates, is really a common enemy. We've been fighting them all along. You've decided to not fight them. We're going to continue to do that. So in my mind, it's a continuation of Russian interest with the amplification of a desire for Russia to be very bold and open about what they're doing.
Well, I mean, Dennis, basically the Russian argument is Assad is our partner against ISIS. If you Americans are serious about fighting ISIS, join us. What's the American response?
They are turning ISIS on its head as a way of putting us, A, on the defensive, and B, to build their leverage in any potential political process. Our response, as I was suggesting, should be a safe haven. Okay, first there's a humanitarian crisis that has to be dealt with. The humanitarian, the refugees are not going to be absorbed into Europe. The only way we're going to be able to deal with this is to create a place within Syria for them, number one. Number two, if you Russians say you want to have a political process, you want to have a transition, there's going to have to be an opposition with whom, in fact, everyone can work. Well, there's no coherence right now. One way to create that is to create a space in Syria where an opposition can actually be organized.
And do you think that the Obama administration is willing to use an old Cold War metaphor, go eyeball to eyeball with the Russians, set up a safe haven whereby we may find ourselves protecting Syrians against Russian aircraft and Russian artillery, not just Syrian government weapons?
Well, I would like the Obama administration to do that. I do believe one of the motivations for what Putin is doing right now is that in response to seeing us work with the Turks to create an ISIS-free area, he is actually putting more forces in there as a way of trying to limit how far we go in that regard. In a sense, he's trying to deter us from exactly what I am suggesting we should do. And what I'm trying to indicate is the way to deal with Putin is to understand that and to convey to him, we are going to play by your rules. We're not going to continue to play by the rules where we talk a certain game, but we're not prepared to put any skin in the game. So I think at this point, the odds are not likely that we'll do what I'm suggesting, but one of the problems the administration has faced in Syria is that the minimalist approach not only hasn't worked, it's constantly put pressure on us to do more. And once again, a minimalist approach will eventually put us in a situation where we have to do much more than we're doing right now.
Okay, when we come back, I'll turn to Juan, and then we'll expand this conversation and look at overall Obama administration foreign policy concerns in the wake of its victory on the Iran nuclear agreement in just a moment. Again, our panel of foreign policy experts includes Juan Zarate. Juan is Senior Advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Senior National Security Consultant and Analyst for CBS News. To his right is my colleague Dennis Ross, Counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he rejoined after 3 years in the Obama administration. So, Juan, before we leave Syria itself, you wanted to weigh in on something that Dennis was saying.
Yeah, Dennis was making a remarkably important point about sort of where American policy has been, a minimalist policy that's requiring, at the end of the day, a maximalist approach. And I think to your question, one of the challenges of our policy has been that we've been unwilling to confront Iranian interests, Russian interests, and other interests on the ground in the context of Syria while we engage in broader and other diplomatic issues like the Iranian nuclear deal or the Ukrainian problem. And so the administration has had a very hard time crafting a policy that's imaginative and creative, in part because they've constrained their willingness to actually aggravate counterparts like the Iranians and the Russians in Syria itself. The counter view is that perhaps they should have put those interests right in the crosshairs as we are involved in those negotiations, simply saying to the Iranians, your ally, President Assad, and his regime are at risk, and they're going to be at risk, and your interests are at risk unless things change on the ground. The U.S. has been unwilling to do that, to go that far, and to Dennis's point, we've had a minimalist policy approach, and that, I think, at the end of the day, is biting us in the rear end.
Well, let me put this in a bigger perspective. The administration just scored perhaps its biggest foreign policy victory from its perspective in negotiating, completing, and what looks like is winning congressional approval for the Iran nuclear agreement. Now there's about a year left before our presidential election. What does the president do in this year? Does an administration at this point run out of steam? Does it find new energy? Both of you gentlemen have been in the final year of presidential administrations. What's your experience? Do they run out of steam, or do they find new energy for a last big push on foreign policy issues?
You know, I think the key is, do they see a mission? Second-term presidents and second-term administrations tend to lose intellectual energy as you move towards the end of the administration. People leave, there's a kind of fatigue, unless the president himself, in fact, has a mission that he grabs onto. In the case of President Clinton, you know, he was seized with Middle East peace, and so he wanted to work that until the very end. So I think a lot depends upon where is President Obama. Does he have a foreign policy, national security objective that seizes him and in a sense motivates him? Now, on the one hand, I would say implementing the Iran deal, not just having negotiated, but implementing it. The president's, after all, the one who said, my name's going to be on this. So does he focus on implementation in a way that is designed to ensure that it doesn't just work for the remainder of his term, but is likely to work for his successors as well? That, I think, is essential. And what I would like to see him do is to realize that a lot of these different pieces actually do fit together. We're talking about Syria. If he really wants Iran not to engage in destabilizing behaviors throughout the rest of the region, if he really wants to empower the more pragmatic forces within the Iranian regime, the key is to show that those who are costing Iran are the ones who are engaging in adventures in the region. Sanctions brought the Iranians to the table on the nuclear issue because the price was too high. In the region, when you have Qasem Soleimani and the Al-Quds forces looking like they're changing the balance of power in Iran's favor, that doesn't empower the pragmatists within the Iranian elite. What empowers the pragmatists is that, you know, what they're doing works, and what people like Qasem Soleimani is not working, and it's costing Iran.
So, Juan, your experience from the end of a second-term administration.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time at the end of the Bush administration worrying about what the handover would be to the next administration, with a very clear directive from the president being, we are going to set the table as effectively and efficiently for the next team as possible. And what's interesting about that, Rob, and I think it's going to be a challenge for this administration, is this dual imperative of establishing your legacy. So for President Bush, that in many ways was setting Iraq right, you know, leaving office with Iraq in the best place possible for his successor, but also handover and handing over issues that are left incomplete in the best position possible. Usually those two should dovetail and should be complementary, but there can often be a discord between what a president sees as his legacy and what the handover may be. I'll give you one example in the Obama administration. The question of what happens in Afghanistan next, post-2016. The president has committed to pulling all U.S. troops out by the end of his term. The real interesting question, though, for a handover for the next administration is that the right posture for the U.S. government and for our allies on the ground? Should we not perhaps keep some troops on the ground? And so there's no doubt internal tension. You've begun to see this debate on this issue and others, where the legacy would drive a certain decision by the time the president walks out the door. No troops in Afghanistan. The handover, the proper handover for the future of the country and our interest may dictate a different approach. And with President Bush, one thing that was interesting was the president made a decision at the very tail end of his administration that he was not going to make decisions that would lock in his successor. And so, for example, the Afghan review, which had been completed and was ready to be announced, was not announced and was handed over to the Obama administration as a template to consider their Afghan policy. So it's a very interesting moment for any administration to consider what is your legacy and what do you want to complete and what then do you have to hand over to the next team. And I think that will be very interesting to watch with this president and with this team.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to have to bring it to a close. This crisis, regrettably, is not going away, and we'll be back to talk about it in the months ahead. Thank you. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول دور حكومتكم في مساعدة اللاجئين السوريين، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.